Have you ever stopped to wonder if what you know about Samuel is the whole truth? A prophet who stood as a pillar of Israel, guiding kings and nations, yet there's something deeper, something the scriptures have kept hidden for generations. What if Samuel's true legacy is far more powerful than we've been led to believe? The mystery surrounding him is about to unfold in a way that will make you question everything. The final secret of Samuel is now ready to be revealed, and it's not what you expect. This revelation ties Samuel's purpose to something greater, a divine plan that stretches beyond Israel's history into your life and mine. It's more than prophecy, it's the heart of God's will, waiting to be uncovered, and the implications will shake you to your core. As we prepare to uncover this truth, I invite you to comment 777, not just as a sign of readiness, but as a spiritual alignment with the divine mystery we are about to unlock. Your support through Super Thanks has been incredible, and I want to thank you from the depths of my heart for making this journey possible. You are helping bring this truth into the light. Now, let's step into the story. The final piece of Samuel's legacy is about to be revealed. Hold on tight, because this is a revelation you won't want to miss. Samuel, is he just a prophet? The final secret has been revealed. In the days when the judges ruled, and the heavens seemed to be silent, there was a woman who carried a storm within her. Her name was Hannah, and though her heart was filled with hope, her body was barren. She faced mockery and scorn from her rival, who relentlessly taunted her, reminding her of her unfulfilled longing. Her womb was closed, but her spirit refused to succumb to despair. Despite the heavy sorrow she bore, her husband, Elkanah, loved her deeply. Yet, Hannah's inability to conceive cut through her soul like a knife. The Lord had closed her womb, as it was written in 1 Samuel 15. Year after year, she made her pilgrimage to the temple at Shiloh, offering sacrifices and prayers to God. But each time, the sorrow remained in her heart, a silent companion that would not leave. One day, in the stillness of the temple, as she knelt before the Lord, her heart broke open. She poured out her soul in desperate prayer, with a fervor born of anguish and a spirit humbled by longing. She made a vow that would echo through the heavens. "O Lord Almighty," she cried, "if you will only look on your servant's misery, and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever touch his head." 1 Samuel 1:11. It was a prayer of profound sincerity, the kind of plea that reached beyond the walls of the temple and into the very heart of God. And God, who sees the heart of all, heard her cry. Her prayer, filled with both desperation and hope, did not fall on deaf ears. In the depths of her sorrow, God was preparing to reveal his power in a way she could not yet imagine. How many times in our own lives have we prayed with the same intensity, holding nothing back, hoping that God will hear our cries? When the heavens seem silent, does our faith falter, or do we press on, trusting that God hears even the deepest, most hidden pain of our hearts? As Hannah prayed fervently, her lips moved silently, her heart desperate yet trusting in God. The priest Eli, noticing her, assumed she was drunk and rebuked her for her actions. But Hannah, undeterred, replied with a voice full of anguish, I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Achat Samuel Achat Chamesh Asara. Upon hearing her explanation, Eli understood the depth of her prayer and, with compassion, he blessed her. Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. Achat Samuel Achat Sheva Asara. In that moment, Hannah felt the weight of her sorrow lifted. The peace of God began to fill her heart, and she believed with unwavering faith that her prayer had been heard. Hannah returned home, her spirit transformed, trusting that God would fulfill his promise. And in his perfect timing, her request was granted. Not long after, Hannah conceived, and the day came when she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, meaning God has heard. For indeed, God had listened to her cry and answered her prayer. 1 Samuel 1:20. Samuel, the child she had longed for, was the manifestation of God's faithfulness and his attentiveness to her suffering. In the days that followed, as Hannah held Samuel in her arms, she saw not just a child, but a divine promise fulfilled. Samuel's name was a testimony of God's care, a reminder that God hears the deepest cries of the heart. Hannah's journey is a testament to the power of faith in the midst of despair. Though the years of waiting were filled with pain, she held on to the belief that God would answer her prayers. And in the answer, not only was her longing fulfilled, but her faith was strengthened, showing us that sometimes the most profound answers come after the most intense trials. But as Samuel grew, a new challenge arose for Hannah. She had made a vow to the Lord that she would dedicate her son to his service. With each passing day, her love for him deepened, and yet she knew the time was drawing near to fulfill that sacred promise. Samuel had grown from the helpless infant she had cradled into a young child, now ready to be devoted to the Lord. The moment of separation was inevitable, and with a heavy heart, Hannah prepared to honor her vow, as was their tradition. She and her husband Elkanah made their annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, but this year, unlike any before, Hannah did not travel alone. She brought Samuel with her, for the time had come to dedicate him to the Lord. With a mixture of love and sorrow, she approached Eli, the priest, and spoke these words, "I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. Now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord." 1 Samuel 1:27-8. Her words were filled with devotion and obedience, but beneath them lay a mother's heart breaking at the thought of parting with her son. She had carried him in her womb, nurtured him through infancy, and watched him grow. Now, she was entrusting him to God's care, knowing that Samuel's life would no longer be in her hands. The weight of her decision was both profound and painful. Yet Hannah knew that this was an act of faith, a surrender to God's will. Together, she and Elkanah worshipped the Lord there at Shiloh, acknowledging that Samuel's life was now a sacred offering. Her trust in God was unshakable, but the pain of separation was undeniable. As she left, Samuel remained in the temple to serve under Eli, and Hannah was left with the comfort of knowing that her child was now where he belonged, in the presence of the Lord. Each year, though the sorrow did not diminish, Hannah continued to visit Samuel, bringing him a small robe that she had lovingly crafted herself. And every year, as Elkanah and Hannah returned to offer their sacrifices, Eli would bless them, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." 1 Samuel 2:20. It was a blessing, a reminder that God had honored her faith and obedience. But it was not just a blessing of words, it was a blessing of future promises. For the Lord would not leave her empty. In time, God was gracious to Hannah, fulfilling his promises once more. She gave birth to 3 more sons and 2 daughters, each child a testament to God's faithfulness. Meanwhile, Samuel grew up in the temple, in the presence of the Lord, his life becoming a living symbol of Hannah's devotion and trust in God. 1 Samuel 2:19-1. Samuel's story was not only one of answered prayers but also one of a mother's deep sacrifice, trusting that God's plans were greater than her own. As Samuel faithfully served in the temple under Eli's guidance, the nation of Israel found itself spiraling into deeper corruption. A question loomed over the young boy's future. Would he, raised under Eli's watchful eye, be able to resist the encroaching tide of moral decay? Or would the pervasive darkness of the culture around him eventually swallow him whole? Would he follow in the footsteps of Eli, inheriting the ways of a compromised priesthood? Or would he rise above it, answering a higher calling? The environment in which Samuel grew was far from conducive to holiness. Darkness thickened around him as the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, turned the house of God into a place of corruption. These men, entrusted with sacred duties, had turned their backs on righteousness. They stole the offerings meant for God, defiled the women who served at the temple, and mocked the very essence of holiness. Their actions were an affront to God, as they had no regard for the sanctity of the Lord's commands. Eli's sons, who should have been models of integrity, were instead scoundrels, their hearts far from the Lord. They treated God's offerings with contempt, turning a place of worship into a den of iniquity. The priests had a customary practice when the people came to offer their sacrifices. A servant of the priest would approach with a 3-pronged fork, ready to plunge it into the boiling meat, whether in a pan, kettle, cauldron, or pot. The priest would then take whatever the fork brought up for himself. This practice was common, a way of providing for the priests from the people's offerings. But the sons of Eli twisted this sacred ritual to satisfy their greed. Even before the fat had been properly burned, they would send their servant to demand raw meat for the priests. If the person offering the sacrifice objected, asking that the fat be burned first, the servant would reply with contempt, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." 1 Samuel 2:3-10. This brazen disregard for the Lord's commands was not just a minor infraction, it was a direct violation of the sacred trust placed upon the priests. Hophni and Phinehas, through their actions, were not only robbing the people, but they were dishonoring God himself. Their behavior had become a stain upon the house of God. And yet, it seemed as though the rot was allowed to spread unchecked. Amid the corruption and decay surrounding him, the boy Samuel continued to grow, not just in stature, but in favor with the Lord and with people. In the midst of a society crumbling under moral rot, God's hand was upon Samuel, quietly shaping him for something greater. It's often in the quietest hearts that God's loudest calls are heard, and Samuel's heart, tender and open, would soon respond to a divine invitation that would alter the course of his life. One night, in the deep stillness between dusk and dawn, When the world was wrapped in silence, the heavens broke with a single whispered name. Eli, whose eyesight had grown dim with age, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God still flickered faintly, but the house was silent, save for the sound of Samuel resting near the ark of God. Then, in the quiet darkness, the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." The whisper sliced through the night like a blade, clear and sharp. Samuel, startled, bolted upright, his heart racing. Had Eli called him? He sprang from his bed and stumbled into Eli's room, breathless. "Here I am. You called me." But Eli, his senses dulled by age and years of spiritual compromise, waved him away. "I did not call. Go back and lie down," he replied. Samuel, confused but obedient, returned to his bed and lay down again. The silence swallowed the room once more. Then, again, the Lord called, "Samuel," the same voice, the same quiet command. Samuel jumped up, rushing once more to Eli. "Here I am. You called me, my son." But Eli, now weary and uncomprehending of the divine call, once again dismissed him. "I did not call. Go back and lie down." What did one intuitive? At this point, Samuel had yet to know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. He was still unaware of the source of the voice, though his heart was beginning to stir with something far beyond the ordinary. The third time, the Lord called Samuel by name. He rose again, heart pounding with anticipation, and hurried to Eli. "Here I am. You called me." This time, Eli, with the wisdom of age and finally realizing the truth, understood that the Lord was calling the boy. In that moment, Eli's spiritual discernment awakened, and he said to Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" End of current. Samuel, eager yet unsure, went back to his place, lying down in silence, waiting. Then, once more, the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And this time, Samuel, understanding now, responded with a heart full of readiness, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Achat Samuel, Shalosh, Shesh, Esa. In that moment, Samuel's life was marked forever. He had heard the voice of God, and his response was one of deep submission and openness. "Speak, for your servant is listening." It is a cry that echoes throughout the ages, reminding us all of the importance of listening when God calls. Samuel had not just heard the voice, he had responded to it with reverence and obedience, setting the stage for his role as the prophet who would lead Israel back to righteousness. It was a moment of divine revelation, not only for Samuel but also for Eli, who would later see through his eyes the true purpose of God's calling. What Samuel heard next would chill him to his very core. The Lord spoke words that would forever alter the course of his life and the fate of Israel, a prophecy of judgment against the house of Eli. This was no ordinary message, it was a declaration that would echo through the generations. God's voice rang out, heavy with authority. "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli. The guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Achat Samuel Shalosh Achat Asara Arba Asara. These words were a prophetic declaration of irreversible judgment. No sacrifice, no offering, no prayer would atone for the corruption Eli had allowed to fester in his household. His son, Hophni and Phinehas, had committed grievous sins, sins that Eli had known about but had done nothing to stop. God's justice was coming, swift and unrelenting. The weight of this prophecy pressed heavily on Samuel's heart, and as the night stretched on, he lay awake, the burning words of judgment searing through his chest like an unquenchable fire. When morning came, Samuel could not bear the thought of telling Eli what the Lord had revealed to him. His heart trembled at the enormity of the message, and fear gripped him. But Eli, sensing that something grave had been entrusted to the boy, called for him and inquired about the vision. "What is it that he told you?" Eli asked, his voice firm yet weary. Samuel hesitated, but Eli pressed him further, swearing that if he withheld anything, God would deal with him severely. "May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything," he told you. Achat Samuel Shalosh Sheba Asara. Samuel, though terrified, knew he could not hide the truth. With a heavy heart, he recounted everything, the prophecy, the judgment, and the divine warning. He held nothing back. When he finished, Eli, with a somber acceptance, said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." Achat Samuel Shalosh Shmona Asara. The old priest, despite his failings, resigned himself to God's will. The judgment was set, and there was nothing more that could be done. In that moment, Samuel, the boy who once swept the temple floors and quietly served in the background, was now carrying the weight of the Almighty's word. He had become the mouthpiece of God, and Israel would never be the same again. The birth of a prophet often signals the death of an age, and with Samuel's rise, the old order was coming to an end. The judgment against Eli's house was but the beginning of what would unfold in Shiloh. Samuel's every breath now seemed like an indictment against the priests around him, the very men who had failed in their duties. As he grew, so did his role as God's prophet. His word became the guiding light for Israel, and the nation recognized Samuel as a true prophet of the Lord. From Dan to Beersheba, the people acknowledged the hand of God upon him, and they knew that he was attested by God himself. God continued to appear to Samuel at Shiloh, revealing himself even more deeply. Samuel became a vessel of divine revelation, and not a single word that came from his mouth fell to the ground. Everything he spoke, the people knew, was the truth of God, unerring, unshakable, and pure. Israel, once again, was being shaped by the voice of God. But this time, it would be through the young prophet Samuel, and the world around him, with its decaying priesthood and its failed leadership, was about to be transformed. Now the time came when the Israelites went out to fight the Philistines, and the two armies faced each other across a valley that seemed to tremble with the weight of impending doom. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer, while the Philistines set up their camp at Aphek. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as both sides prepared for a clash that would determine the fate of the battle. But when the first confrontation occurred, it ended in disaster for Israel. 4,000 men lay dead. Panic quickly spread through the Israelite camp. Fear set in, and their hearts wavered. It was in the midst of this chaos that someone cried out. A desperate idea taking root in the minds of the soldiers. Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh, that it may save us from the hand of our enemies. 1 Samuel 4-3. It was as if the Ark, the sacred symbol of God's presence, had become a talisman in their minds, a magical box. A guaranteed victory. They believed that its mere presence would turn the tide of battle in their favor. Without hesitation, Hophni and Phinehas, the very same corrupt priests who had defiled God's house, took the ark and carried it into the battlefield, the weight of their own sin dragging behind them like a shadow. When the ark arrived in the Israelite camp, a mighty roar erupted from the soldiers. The ground seemed to shake with their hope, and Israel's confidence soared. Surely, with the ark among them, victory was assured. But the Philistines, though shaken by the sight of the ark, did not cower in fear. Instead, they rallied together, determined to fight to the death. Their courage, born of desperation, fueled them in ways that Israel had not anticipated. They fought with everything they had, and the battle turned brutal, bloody, unforgiving, and final. The Israelites, despite their belief in the ark's power, were decisively defeated. The Philistines pressed on relentlessly, and every Israelite man fled to his tent, broken by the scale of their loss. The slaughter was immense. Israel lost 0 foot soldiers that day. And, in a crushing blow, the Ark of God was captured by the Philistines. The sacred symbol of God's presence was now in enemy hands. Even worse, Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died in the battle, their lives claimed by the judgment of God they had long ignored. 1 Samuel 4:10. Back in Shiloh, an old man named Eli sat by the road, his heart trembling for the ark. He had heard the news of Israel's defeat, but his greatest fear was for the ark, the very presence of God that had been taken from them. Eli's eyes, dim with age, could not see the true scope of what had occurred, but his soul understood the weight of the loss. The ark was no longer in the hands of God's people. It was now in the possession of the Philistines, who celebrated their victory with jubilant rejoicing. The Philistines had captured the Ark of the Covenant, a moment that would forever change the course of Israel's history. That same day, a Benjamite ran from the battlefield and rushed toward Shiloh, his clothes torn in mourning and dust upon his head, a visible sign of the calamity that had befallen Israel. As he entered the town and began to relay the tragic news, the entire city was overcome with grief. The cry that rose from the people was one of deep sorrow, a collective wail that echoed through the streets. The man, desperate to deliver the news, hurried to Eli, who was 98 years old. Eli, whose eyesight had failed him in his advanced years, and could not see the approaching messenger, but his heart likely sensed the gravity of the moment. The Benjamite spoke, his words like a dagger to Eli's heart. Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the Ark of God has been captured. When Eli heard the mention of the ark, the sacred symbol of God's presence. His world shattered. In a moment of complete devastation, Eli fell backward from his chair beside the gate. His neck broke upon impact, and he died, his body, heavy with age and burdened by the weight of his failure, was no longer able to bear the crushing blow of the news. He had led Israel for 40 years, but now his reign had ended in tragedy. 1 Samuel 4:17-1-8. Meanwhile, in the midst of this sorrow, Eli's daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was near the time of her labor. She, too, was consumed by the weight of the news. When she heard that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and husband were both dead, the grief overwhelmed her, and she went into labor. The pain of her contractions was compounded by the crushing weight of the disaster. She gave birth to a son, but as she struggled to bring him into the world, the anguish of the moment overcame her. With her final breaths, she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." 1 Samuel 4:22. Ichabod's name was a symbol of the spiritual loss that Israel had endured, a name that would forever be associated with the tragedy of the ark's capture and the collapse of a nation's faith. The glory of Israel, once symbolized by the ark, had departed. What had once been a people set apart by God now faced the painful consequences of their disobedience and corruption. The loss of the ark, the death of Eli and his sons, and the grief of Phinehas's wife marked the end of an era for Israel. The glory had indeed departed, and the path forward was uncertain, shrouded in darkness and despair. While the Israelites saw nothing but defeat, heaven had quietly planted a seed that would one day grow into hope. Though the ark of God had been captured and the priesthood lay in ruins, a prophet still stood among them. Samuel, though seemingly a mere boy when the judgment fell, would rise to lead Israel from the ashes of its despair. The ark, though captured by the Philistines, wreaked havoc wherever it went. The Philistines carried the ark into the temple of their god, Dagon, and placed it beside the idol as a symbol of their supposed victory. But when the people of Ashdod rose the next day, they were met with a strange sight. Dagon, their mighty god, had fallen flat on his face before the ark of the Lord. They quickly placed the statue back in its place. But the next day, it had fallen again, this time with its head and hands broken off. The ark of God, though in enemy hands, was a powerful force of judgment. It brought plagues, tumors, and terror upon the Philistines. Their cities were struck with suffering until, broken and terrified, they returned the ark to Israel. But the devastation had already been done. Shiloh had fallen. The priesthood lay in ruins, and Israel wandered in spiritual desolation for 20 long years. Yet, even in the darkness, God was raising up a light. A voice rose among them. Samuel, who had once been a mere boy in the temple, now stood as the prophet of Israel. With the house of Eli gone, the mantle of leadership had passed to Samuel, and God would use him mightily to restore the nation. Samuel spoke to the Israelites, calling them to repentance. If you are returning to the Lord with all your hearts, then rid yourselves of the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths, and commit yourselves to the Lord, and serve him only. He will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. 1 Samuel 7-3. The Israelites, broken by years of defeat, listened to Samuel and, in their sorrow, put away their Baals and Ashtoreths, recommitting themselves to the Lord. Samuel then called for a gathering of the people at Mizpah, where he would intercede on their behalf before God. As the Israelites assembled, the Philistine rulers heard of the gathering and, sensing an opportunity, marched out to attack Israel. The Israelites were filled with fear, and they pleaded with Samuel, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines." 1 Samuel 7-8. With unwavering faith, Samuel took a lamb and offered it as a burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to God, and heaven responded with a mighty, deafening thunderclap that shattered the skies. The Philistine army, thrown into panic and confusion by the sound, faltered, and Israel surged forward, defeating their enemies with ease. The victory was complete, and Samuel, in thanksgiving, took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen. He named the stone Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." 1 Samuel 7:12. In that moment, Israel recognized the power of God at work, and the nation was forever changed. The glory that had departed when the ark was captured now returned to Israel in the form of a renewed commitment to the Lord, and a prophet raised up to lead them. Samuel's victory over the Philistines marked a turning point in Israel's history, reminding the people that, no matter how far they had fallen, God's hand was still at work to deliver them, and his faithfulness would carry them forward. Under Samuel's leadership, Israel flourished. The land, once ravaged by sin, began to bloom again, and the people tasted the peace that had long eluded them. The Philistines, once a constant threat, were subdued. The Amorites, who had long been enemies, sought peace. Justice flowed like rivers across the land as Samuel judged Israel with unwavering faithfulness. Year after year, town after town, heart after heart, Samuel's influence grew. At his home in Ramah, he built an altar to the Lord, a powerful symbol that wherever he went, God reigned first and foremost. The land that had once been barren now yielded its crops. And for a generation, Israel remembered the Lord and walked in his ways. But as with all things, seasons shift, and the winds of change began to blow. The human heart, fickle and restless, soon began to turn. Even as Samuel's voice carried with divine authority, the people began to whisper among themselves, their hearts stirring with a desire for a new kind of leader, not one chosen by God, but one shaped by their own fears and desires. For no leader, no matter how righteous, can outlast the secret cravings of a restless people. Over time, Samuel grew older, his hair turned silver, and his steps grew slower. But as his physical strength waned, the whispers among the people grew louder, and the murmur of discontent shifted into a cry for something new. Samuel, whose voice had once called the people to repentance, would now hear them call for something else, a king, a leader like the other nations had. The Bible does not mention Samuel's wife, but it records that Samuel had 2 sons, Joel and Abijah, who served as judges at Beersheba. But unlike their father, they did not walk in his ways. They were swayed by dishonest gain, accepting bribes and perverting justice. 1 Samuel 8-3. Their corrupt behavior became a key factor in the people's growing demand for a new type of leadership. The elders of Israel, seeing the increasing unrest and sensing the winds of change, gathered at Ramah. They stormed into Samuel's home, presenting him with their demand, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." 1 Samuel 8-5. This request deeply displeased Samuel. He had served Israel faithfully, and now the people were rejecting his leadership and, in essence, rejecting God's rule over them. In his displeasure, Samuel turned to the Lord in prayer, and the Lord spoke to him, saying, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." 1 Samuel 8-7-9. The people's cry for a king was not just a rejection of Samuel, but a rejection of the Lord himself as their sovereign ruler. They longed for a king to lead them as the other nations were led. But they failed to realize that in doing so, they were forsaking the true king who had always been faithful to them. And so, God instructed Samuel to listen to their request, but to warn them of the consequences that would come with a human king, what they would lose in exchange for the rule of a man. It was a pivotal moment in Israel's history, a moment that would mark the transition from a theocratic rule to a monarchy, and the start of a new era, one shaped not by God's will, but by the desires of a restless, fearful people. Samuel conveyed to the people all the words of the Lord in response to their demand for a king. He warned them of the consequences of their request, speaking the words that God had given him. "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. You yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." 1 Samuel 8, 11-10. Despite the warning, the people's demand only grew louder. "No, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles." 1 Samuel 8:19-0. When Samuel heard all that, the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. And the Lord answered, "Listen to them and give them a king." 1 Samuel 8:20-22. God allowed the people to have their king, though he knew it would not be his best for them. It was a moment of divine permission, but also of divine sorrow. Israel was rejecting God's direct rule over them in favor of human leadership, and God, though grieved, would grant their request. Meanwhile, beyond the hills, in the land of Benjamin, a tall and handsome man named Saul, son of Kish, was wandering the countryside searching for his father's lost donkeys. Unbeknownst to Saul, destiny was closing in on him, and what seemed like a mere search for livestock was actually the beginning of a journey that would change the fate of Israel. Saul was tall, head and shoulders above any man in Israel, and strikingly handsome. But as the days passed, and Saul and his servant continued their search, they grew weary, and the servant suggested consulting the man of God in a nearby town. Samuel. The day before Saul's arrival, God had revealed to Samuel that a man from the land of Benjamin would come to him about this time tomorrow. I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me. 1 Samuel 9:15, 1:6. It was a divine appointment, set long before Saul knew his role in the unfolding story. When Saul approached Samuel the next day, their eyes met, and it was as if heaven itself had written Saul's name on his forehead. Samuel welcomed Saul with a warmth and honor that Saul had not anticipated. The next morning, at the edge of the city, Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it upon Saul's head, declaring, "Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance?" 1 Samuel 10:1. This moment marked the beginning of Saul's kingship, and Samuel gave him prophetic signs that would confirm his divine appointment. He would meet 2 men who would tell him that the donkeys had been found. He would encounter 3 men carrying goats, bread, and wine. Finally, he would meet a group of prophets, and the Spirit of the Lord would rush upon him, transforming him in a moment. These signs were fulfilled in exact detail, confirming that Saul had indeed been chosen by God. But beneath the surface, Saul's insecurities and reluctance festered. Despite the clear signs and divine confirmation, Saul was not yet confident in his calling. His fear and hesitation would continue to challenge him as he stepped into the role that had been ordained for him. The weight of being Israel's king was not one he had sought, and the battle within him would shape the course of his reign. As Saul struggled between his calling and his fear of what lay ahead, when Samuel finally called the nation together to reveal their new king, the moment of anticipation was palpable. But when the time came to present Saul, he was nowhere to be found. He was hiding among the baggage, an unexpected and telling sign of his reluctance. Despite this, Samuel found him, brought him forward, and declared to all the people, "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people." 1 Samuel 10:24. The people responded with joy and excitement, shouting, "Long live the king!" And so, Saul was anointed as Israel's first king. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he would reign over Israel for 42 years. At first, his rule was marked by strength and promise, but as with many kings, storms began to brew beneath the surface. Despite his early successes, Saul's inner struggles, his pride, impatience, arrogance, and disobedience to God would lead to his downfall. His failure to fully obey God's commands led to God's rejection of him as king. Samuel confronted him, saying, "I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel." 1 Samuel 15:20. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul desperately caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Samuel, with a heart heavy with grief, said, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you." 1 Samuel 15:27-28. Saul's reign had ended, but even in rejection, God was already preparing his next king, one chosen not by outward appearance, but by the heart. God spoke to Samuel, asking, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel?" Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, because I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Achat Samuel Shesh Asara Achat. Samuel was afraid of Saul's wrath, so he traveled in secret. Arriving at Jesse's house under the pretense of offering a sacrifice, Jesse had 7 sons. His firstborn, Eliab; the second son, Abinadab; the third, Shemaiah; the fourth, Nethanel; the fifth, Radai; the sixth, Ozem; and the seventh, David. 1 Chronicles 20 et 13:15. As Samuel entered the house, Jesse presented all his sons, but David, the youngest, was out in the fields tending the sheep. Samuel, sensing that God had not chosen any of the sons before him, asked for David to be brought in. A messenger was sent to the field to call him. When David entered the room, something remarkable happened. The Lord spoke to Samuel, saying, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." Achat Samuel Shesh Asara Shtim Asara. Without hesitation, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the presence of his brothers. And from that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel, having fulfilled his divine mission, returned to Ramah. Thus, the young shepherd boy, who had been overlooked by his own family, was chosen by God to be the next king of Israel. He would rise from the fields to the throne, anointed not for his outward appearance, but for his heart, a heart that would one day be known as the one after God's own heart. This was the beginning of David's journey, a journey that would shape the future of Israel and lead to a reign that, despite its flaws, would lay the foundation for God's eternal kingdom. Saul's jealousy toward David grew like a poison in his heart, and in his fear, he sought to kill him. Desperate and hunted, David fled for his life, seeking refuge with Samuel at Ramah. There, in a place called Naioth, Samuel had gathered a secret community, a school of prophets. It was not a fortress of stone, but a fortress of spirit, a sacred haven where young men were trained to hear God's voice, to speak with holy fire, and to stand unwavering against the tides of corruption sweeping across the land. Samuel, though old and weathered by years of trials, was unbroken. He poured his remaining strength into these men, passing the torch of divine leadership to a new generation, one that would outlast kings and empires. The years had taken their toll on Samuel. The fiery boy who once heard God's whisper in the night had now become an old man, moving with slow and heavy steps. He had seen too much kings rising and falling, covenants broken, promises betrayed. Yet through it all, he remained faithful, judging Israel with unwavering integrity. He continued to speak the words of God to a nation that had drifted far from its calling. But now, his journey was nearing its end. His time had come. Then, the day arrived. The scriptures record it simply. Without fanfare, Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. 1 Samuel 25:1. The prophet who had once held the fate of nations in his prayers was laid to rest in the soil of his homeland, in the place where he had spent his life serving God and guiding his people. But even in death, Samuel could not be silenced. His legacy, his spirit, would rise again, summoned from the grave for one final dreadful meeting. at the darkness of a soul's deepest desperation, when the weight of Israel's sins became unbearable, Samuel would return. His voice, though still, would echo through the ages for this final encounter. It was a meeting not of peace, but of judgment, a final word for a king who had lost his way. Samuel's life had been marked by divine purpose, and even in death, that purpose would not end. The story of Samuel, from his humble beginnings to his final meeting beyond the grave, was a testimony to the enduring power of God's call and the unrelenting consequences of rejecting it. After the death of Samuel, Saul stood alone, desperate, at the end of his rope. The God who had once spoken to him through dreams, through the Urim, and through the prophets, had become silent. Saul's heart grew heavy with dread, for no divine message came to him. He had sought guidance from every possible source, but now God no longer answered him. As the weight of his fear and guilt crushed him, Saul resorted to a forbidden act. He sought out a medium, a witch at Endor. In the dead of night, disguised and trembling with terror, he pleaded, "Consult a spirit for me, and bring up the one I name." The woman, fearful of the king's wrath, yet compelled by his desperation, obeyed. To her horror, it was not a mere familiar spirit she conjured, but Samuel himself, unbound by the grave, standing before her in a robe, ancient and solemn. Saul, terrified and overwhelmed, collapsed before the prophet, desperate for guidance. He begged, "What will I do?" But Samuel's words were unflinching, unyielding. "Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." 1 Samuel 28-18:1-9. The judgment had been pronounced, and there was no turning back. Saul's fate was sealed, his reign coming to an end in the most devastating way. The very next day, Saul fell by his own sword. His 3 sons and all his men perished with him on that same day. It was the tragic and final echo of Samuel's life, a life spent calling a nation back to God, to repentance, and to righteousness. The boy who had once heard God's whisper, the young prophet who had risen from humble beginnings to guide Israel, had now become the man whose voice, even in death, could not be silenced. Samuel's legacy resonates profoundly throughout the history of Israel. As a prophet, he was the mouthpiece of God, delivering messages of warning, hope, and divine direction to a wayward people. He was also a priest who ministered at the tabernacle, leading Israel in their religious practices and keeping the flame of God's covenant alive. Samuel is remembered as the last of the judges, those who led Israel before the establishment of the monarchy. His leadership helped keep the nation united in times of conflict, and his spiritual guidance was a pillar that held Israel together. His legacy remains one of profound importance, shaping the very foundation of Israel's history and continuing to echo through the ages. Samuel's most significant and enduring act was anointing the first 2 kings of Israel. In a time when the people cried out for a leader to guide them, Samuel anointed Saul, the first king. Saul initially led the people with promise, but his reign faltered and ultimately ended in failure due to his disobedience to God. This failure marked a pivotal moment in Israel's history. Later, God led Samuel to anoint David, a young man after God's own heart. David's anointing signified the beginning of the Davidic dynasty, which would have profound significance in the history of Israel, with God's promises to David echoing throughout the generations. Samuel's life is marked by a deep moral integrity, and his unwavering commitment to God's will stands out. He was a man of prayer, constantly seeking God's guidance in every aspect of his leadership. Unlike many other leaders throughout Israel's history, even in his old age, when the people demanded a king, Samuel did not act out of personal ambition or self-interest. Instead, he sought God's will with humility, showing that true leadership is not about personal gain, but about faithfully serving God and the people. Samuel remained devoted to God throughout his life, holding Israel accountable for their faithfulness, reminding them that their prosperity depended on their obedience to God. Samuel's leadership and prophetic ministry were foundational to the development of the prophetic office in Israel. He didn't merely speak God's words, but also trained other prophets, passing on his knowledge and wisdom. His influence can be seen in the rise of prophets like Nathan, Gad, and others, who continued the work he had started. Samuel's life exemplified prayer, devotion, and a deep, ongoing relationship with God. His prayers were powerful, often turning the tide of Israel's fortunes. He was not merely a leader, but a man who lived in constant communication with the divine, making him one of the most significant figures in Israel's spiritual history. Samuel's story also underscores an essential truth: God can use anyone, no matter their circumstances. Samuel's mother, Hannah, was barren and ridiculed by others. Yet through her unwavering faith and prayer, God answered her plea, and Samuel was born. This shows that God has a unique purpose for each life, and he can use anyone for his divine will, regardless of their limitations or difficult circumstances. Samuel's life stands as a testimony to the power of faith, prayer, and God's ability to transform even the most unlikely individuals into instruments of his purpose. Through Samuel, we see how God fulfills his plans in ways that transcend human expectations. The story of Samuel teaches us powerful lessons about the importance of obedience to God. Samuel's life was characterized by a consistent and unwavering commitment to follow God's direction, even when it was difficult. This obedience brought blessings and stability not only to Samuel but also to Israel. On the other hand, the disobedience of others, such as Hophni and Phinehas, and later King Saul, led to their downfall and the tragic consequences of forsaking God's commands. Samuel's story reminds us that obedience to God is always the right path, even when it isn't the easiest or the most popular choice. Through Samuel's life, we also learn the vital role of prayer in a believer's life. Samuel's reliance on prayer and his constant seeking of God's will through it led to powerful and lasting results. His prayers shaped the course of Israel's history and brought divine intervention at critical moments. Samuel's example emphasizes that prayer is not merely a ritual, but a necessary part of our relationship with God, one that shapes our actions, decisions, and ultimately, our lives. Another profound lesson from Samuel's story is that God values our hearts and character more than outward appearances, possessions, or status. When Samuel was sent to anoint a new king from the sons of Jesse, it was David, the youngest and least likely of the brothers, who was chosen by God. David's selection over Saul shows us that God often chooses the humble, the overlooked, and the weak to accomplish his purposes in ways that defy human expectations. In this, we are reminded that God's ways are not our ways, and His judgment is based on the heart, not external factors. Samuel's trust in God's plan, even when the future seemed uncertain and unclear, offers a lesson in faith. He trusted God even when the path ahead was shrouded in mystery, and this trust serves as an example for us, especially in times of difficulty or uncertainty. When we face challenges and the future seems unsure, Samuel's life teaches us to lean on God, trust in His plan, and walk forward with faith, knowing He holds our future in His hands. Lastly, Samuel's words as a judge, priest, and prophet still resonate through the ages. While the world may forget its prophets, heaven never does. Samuel's call to Israel, and to us, remains timeless. Return to the Lord with all your heart. In a world filled with distractions and temptations, Samuel's call challenges us to remember that God desires our whole heart, our full devotion. His message of repentance, obedience, and faith continues to echo, urging us to seek God above all else and to live lives that honor Him. Samuel's legacy is not only in the stories of the past, but in the ongoing invitation to return to the Lord, for He alone is worthy of our trust and devotion. In reflecting on the life of Samuel, we are reminded of the unwavering power of obedience, faith, and humility in the face of challenges. Samuel's story is a beacon of hope and an enduring example of how one person, dedicated to God's will, can shape the course of a nation. His life teaches us that obedience to God's voice, no matter the difficulty or the path less traveled, is always the right choice. It's not always easy to follow God's direction, especially when the world around us chooses a different path. But as Samuel's life demonstrates, God's blessings follow those who walk faithfully in His commands. We also learn the vital importance of prayer and seeking God's will, especially in a world that is often noisy with distractions. Samuel's constant communion with God through prayer turned the tide in Israel's fortunes and reminds us that in our own lives, turning to God in prayer can bring about powerful and lasting changes. When we trust in His plan and embrace His guidance, we align ourselves with a purpose greater than ourselves, and that's where true fulfillment lies. In today's world, much like in Samuel's time, we can often feel lost or insignificant, overlooked by the hustle and bustle of life. But the story of David's anointing tells us that God sees the heart, not the outward appearances or status. Just as God chose David from among his brothers, He can use anyone, no matter their circumstances, to fulfill His greater purpose. Our worth and potential are not defined by the world, but by the Creator who sees the deepest parts of our being. Samuel's legacy continues to call us back to God, reminding us to turn our hearts fully towards Him. In the midst of life's challenges, we can find peace, purpose, and direction when we seek Him first. So, let this story not just be a lesson from the past, but a call to action for our present. Let's strive to live lives of obedience, prayer, and humility, and be the generation that chooses to honor God above all else. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay connected. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story or lesson. And please, comment below with your thoughts. Let's continue this conversation together. Thank you for being here, and may we all walk in the footsteps of Samuel, with hearts open to God's voice, ready to serve with unwavering faith.